The day has finally arrived. It's time to rock your podcast interview. In this video, I'm gonna share some tips that are gonna help you make sure that you do a fantastic job as a podcast guest. In a previous video, we went through the checklist of the preparation side of things. So in case you're new to podcast guesting and you're about to do a podcast interview, make sure to check out that video first. When it comes to interview day, the first thing you want to do is to make sure that on your computer you don't have anything open unless it's something you need. So make sure to close all of the applications, all of the apps, all of the sites, all of the tabs, all of the programs, even those that run in the background, like Dropbox, for example. Make sure that you close everything down unless it's really something you're gonna need during the interview, so that you avoid your computer slowing down, your internet connection slowing down, and perhaps your computer crashing. It's enough for you to be ready just 5 minutes before the interview. Hosts may be doing other interviews before yours, or perhaps you are doing interviews back to back. And that means that people are busy. So even if you're ready 20 minutes before the interview, there is no point in you letting the host know, because he or she is probably busy. So 5 minutes is more than enough to just prepare and make sure that you're ready for the interview, and you do so on time. Once it's time, don't call. Please don't call. Perhaps the host is setting up at the last minute, so if you call him or her, they're gonna be like struggling to put everything together. Don't call, just send them a message. Let's say Skype is the platform the two of you are gonna use for the interview. Just send a message to say, hey, I'm here, ready to rock when you are. Once the host calls you, always assume that he or she is recording. You may be on a podcast where they record right from the get-go, so you will avoid saying, hey, by the way, are we recording? Just assume that you are recording, and if it sounds as if you aren't, then you can ask for confirmation. But in general, as a rule of thumb, I would say assume as if you guys are recording. Make sure that you guys have a minute or two to do a quick pre-interview chat, and that's where you can ask the host to tell you more about the audience. I think that's a key question. It's very important for you to ask. And then you can also ask for permission to mention the link to your landing page so that you can grow your email list, or if you want to use SMS marketing, ask permission to mention the specific keyword that people are gonna send to the number you're gonna mention. And also you can ask, in case you haven't seen that, you can also ask if there is a show notes page and if it's okay for the host to add the link to your site, to the landing page, and what you cover on that page too. So why does that question matter? Why should you ask that question? If you watched any of my previous videos, you may have heard me say that my background is actually in communication. At both my bachelor's and master's studies, I majored in communication. So I'm able to also give you some pointers when it comes to the communication and also the psychology of communication a little bit. The question, can you tell me more about your audience? It's very important because it allows you to understand who's gonna tune in and listen. And that means that the more you know about the listener, the more things you can say that are tailored, that are relevant. So if you mention case studies, if you make examples or things like that, or even the topic you're gonna touch upon, you can cover it from many different angles. So the more you know about the listeners, the better job you're gonna do as a communicator, first and foremost. If you have recording capabilities, let the host know. Let him or her know that you're more than happy to record the conversation. If you're a podcast host as well, then you probably know how to do that. In case you are a first-time podcast guest, or you simply don't use any software to record podcasts because you don't host them, what you could do, you could look into a tool. There are many different options. The one I use, for example, is called Audacity. There is GarageBand. There is many different tools. You can download, install, and use completely for free. So both Audacity and GarageBand are free. GarageBand, you actually have it if you're using a Mac computer. In that case, you can let the host know that you're gonna record your side of the conversation, or ask them, would you need me to record my side of the conversation? I'm happy to do that. And that's what I typically do. And then I send my side of the conversation, so that regardless of the tool the host uses, regardless of whether there are tech glitches or what have you, I know that I'm gonna sound great because I've recorded my side of the conversation and I've sent it to the host. So I would recommend you do a similar thing. And I'm saying this based on my own experience. To me, it has happened to do interviews where I didn't record my side of the conversation, and then on the actual podcast, I sounded pretty bad, even though I'm using professional recording gear, microphone, mixer, pop filter, audio interface. It sounded pretty bad. In some cases, there was even an echo, even though I've never heard a single echo in any other podcast I've recorded, whether it's as a host or a guest. So to just avoid those kind of inconveniences, always, if possible, let the host know that you have recording capabilities and record your side of the conversation at the very least. Now let's take a moment to actually talk about the rocking the interview. How do you actually go about it? Well, I have a couple of tips for you. Number one, you want to make sure that during the conversation, you're going to mention the host and refer to him or her, or the co-hosts in case it's more than a person, by their first name or names. Remember, the show is not about you. Yes, that's right. It's not about you. It's actually about the listeners, and your job is to provide the listeners with value. So don't make the interview about you. The host may introduce you in the best way ever. He or she may shower you with compliments, obviously give you the room, but make it about the host and the listeners. First of all, when it comes to the host, remember this isn't a monologue, it's a conversation. So when the host asks you a question, don't just go on rants where you just talk for several minutes without making the host feel part of the conversation, or even the listeners for that matter. So bring the host into the conversation. Ask him or her, what are your thoughts, or what do you think? Or if they make a point, just touch upon that point. So make it a conversation, make it a two-way communication and not a monologue where it's just you broadcasting your message. And now the call to action. What can you do to have people go from podcast listeners to join your email list or become members of your community or what have you? Well, the first thing is to make sure that you have a call to action. And a mistake I've seen some podcast guests make, including some people I've actually worked with, is that when the host asks them the final question, they typically have 4, 5, 6 different call to actions. And here's an example. Let's say the host asks, Jan, what's the best way to get in touch with me? If I say, I have a website, janilunga.com, and I'm also on Twitter over at @vjanilunga. I have a Facebook group as well, the Podcast Growth Mastermind, and I have a couple of podcasts. I have my YouTube channel over at janilunga.com/TV, and then I have my Podcast Success Academy over at podcastsuccessacademy.net. And if you want to learn more about me, just go to janilunga.com/about. Now, in the span of a few seconds, I mentioned 4, 5, 6, several calls to actions. And the problem with that approach is that people typically do other things while listening to podcasts. So instead of having a bunch of different calls to actions, we want to have just one specific. We want to direct people toward a specific place. If you have a landing page, that's what you want to direct people toward. If you have a Facebook group, you want to mention that. You can say, I typically say something like, well, I'm all over social media, my site is janilunga.com, but if you want to learn more about blank, you can go to this page. So I typically put the emphasis on the landing page. In terms of when to mention your call to action, typically the host gives you room for that toward the end of the episode. You can also mention the specific landing page, freebie, or whatever during the interview if relevant. You can't expect every single listener to tune in all the way until the end. So if you have a call to action at the end, but you also have something during the conversation, you increase the chances of people actually going for it. And whatever you do, don't have your call to action at the beginning. If a person is listening to you for the first time, you want to provide value, you want to serve them first. You don't want to ask right from the get-go. That's why I would encourage you not to have any call to action at the beginning of the show. I would suggest doing something during the interview if it comes up in a spontaneous way, and then the strong call to action when the host typically will ask you about it toward the end of the episode.